Review of the Excursion, a poem by Charles Lamb. By William Wordsworth, London, 42 pp. 447. The volume before us, as we learn from the preface, is a detached portion of an unfinished poem, containing views of man, nature, and society. To be called the recluse, as having for its principal subject the sensations and opinions of a poet living in retirement, and to be preceded by a record in verse of the origin and progress of the author's own powers, with reference to the fitness which they may be supposed to have conferred for the task. To the completion of this plan, we look forward with a confidence which the execution of the finished part is well calculated to inspire. Meanwhile, in what is before us, there is ample matter for entertainment. For the excursion is not a branch, as might have been suspected, prematurely plucked from the parent tree to gratify an overhasty appetite for applause, but is, in itself, a complete and legitimate production. It opens with the meeting of the poet with an aged man whom he had known from his school days. In plain words, a Scottish peddler. A man who, though of low origin, had received good learning and impressions of the strictest piety from his stepfather, a minister, and village schoolmaster. Among the hills of Athol, the child is described to have become familiar with the appearances of nature in his occupation as a feeder of sheep, and from her silent influences to have derived a character, meditative, tender, and poetical, with an imagination and feelings thus nourished. His intellect not unaided by books, but those, few, and chiefly of a religious cast. The necessity of seeking a maintenance in riper years had induced him to make choice of a profession, the appellation for which has been gradually declining into contempt, but PG 188, which formerly designated a class of men who, journeying in country places when roads presented less facilities for traveling, and the intercourse between towns and villages was unfrequent and hazardous, became a sort of link of neighborhood to distant habitations. Resembling, in some small measure, in the effects of their periodical returns, the caravan which Thomson so feelingly describes as blessing the cheerless Siberian in its annual visitation, with news of humankind. In the solitude incident to this rambling life, power had been given him to keep alive that devotedness to nature which he had imbibed in his childhood, together with the opportunity of gaining such notices of persons and things from his intercourse with society, as qualified him to become a teacher of moral wisdom. With this man, then in a hale old age, released from the burthen of his occupation, yet retaining much of its active habits, the poet meets, and is by him introduced to a second character, a skeptic, one who had been partially roused from an overwhelming desolation, brought upon him by the loss of wife and children, by powerful incitement of hope which the French Revolution in its commencement put forth, but who, disgusted with the failure of all its promises, had fallen back into a laxity of faith and conduct, which induced at length a total despondence as to the dignity and final destination of his species. In the language of the poet, yet he describes himself as subject to compunctious visitations from that silent quarter. The conversations with this person, in which the wanderer asserts the consolatory side of the question against the darker views of human life maintained by his friend, and finally calls to his assistance the experience of a village priest, the third, or rather fourth interlocutor. For the poet himself is one, form the groundwork of the excursion. PG 189. It will be seen by this sketch that the poem is of a didactic nature, and not a fable or story. Yet it is not wanting in stories of the most interesting kind, such as the lovers of Cowper and Goldsmith will recognize as something familiar and congenial to them. We might instance the ruined cottage and the solitary's own story in the first half of the work, and the second half as being almost a continued cluster of narration. But the prevailing charm of the poem is, perhaps, that, conversational as it is in its plan, the dialogue throughout is carried on in the very heart of the most romantic scenery which the poet's native hills could supply, and which, by the perpetual references made to it either in the way of illustration or for variety and pleasurable description's sake, is brought before us as we read. We breathe in the fresh air, as we do while reading Walton's Complete Angler. Only the country about us is as much bolder than Walton's, as the thoughts and speculations, which form the matter of the poem, exceed the trifling pastime and low-pitched conversation of his humble fishermen. We give the description of the two huge peaks, which from some other vale peered into that in which the solitary is entertaining the poet and companion. Those, says their host, to a mind constituted like that of Mr. Wordsworth, the stream, the torrent, and the stirring leaf, seem not merely to suggest associations of deity, but to be a kind of speaking communication with it. He walks through every forest as through some Dodona, and every bird that flits among the leaves, like that miraculous 131 in Tasso, but in language more intelligent, reveals to him far higher love lays. In his poetry, nothing in nature is dead. Motion is synonymous with life. Beside yon spring, says the wanderer, speaking of a deserted well from which, in former times, a poor woman, who died heartbroken, had been used to dispense refreshment to the thirsty traveler. To such a mind, we say, call it strength or weakness. If weakness, assuredly a fortunate one, the visible and audible things of creation present, not dim symbols or curious emblems, which they have done at all times to those who have been gifted with the poetical faculty, but revelations and quick insights into the life within us, the pledge of immortality. I have seen, the poet says, and the illustration is an happy one. Sometimes this harmony is imaged to us by an echo, and in one instance, it is with such transcendent beauty set forth by a shadow and its corresponding substance, that it would be a sin to cheat our readers at once of so happy an illustration of the poet's system, and so fair a proof of his descriptive powers. Combinations, it is confessed, like those reflected in that quiet pool, cannot be lasting. It is enough for the purpose of the poet if they are felt. They are at least his system, and his readers, if they reject them for their creed, may receive them merely as poetry. In him, faith, in friendly alliance and conjunction with the religion of his country, PG 192 appears to have grown up, fostered by meditation and lonely communions with nature. An internal principle of lofty consciousness, which stamps upon his opinions and sentiments, we were almost going to say, the character of an expanded and generous Quakerism. From such a creed we should expect unusual results, and, when applied to the purposes of consolation, more touching considerations than from the mouth of common teachers. The finest speculation of this sort, perhaps in the poem before us, is the notion of the thoughts which may sustain the spirit, while they crush the frame of the sufferer, who from loss of objects of love by death, is commonly supposed to pine away under a broken heart. With the same modifying and incorporating power, he tells us, this is high poetry, though, as we have ventured to lay the basis of the author's sentiments in a sort of liberal Quakerism, from some parts of it, others may, with more plausibility, object to the appearance of a kind of natural Methodism. We could have wished, therefore, that the tale of Margaret had been postponed, till the reader had been strengthened by some previous acquaintance with the author's theory, and not placed in the front of the poem, with a kind of ominous aspect, beautifully tender as it is. It is a tale of a cottage, and its female tenant, gradually decaying together, while she expected the return of one whom poverty and not unkindness had driven from her arms. We trust ourselves only with the conclusion. The fourth book, entitled Despondency Corrected, we consider as the most valuable portion of the poem, for moral grandeur, for wide scope of thought and a long train of lofty imagery, for tender personal appeals, and a versification which we feel we ought to notice, but feel it also so involved in the poetry that we can hardly mention it as a distinct excellence. It stands without competition among our didactic and descriptive verse. The general tendency of the argument, which we might almost affirm to be the leading moral of the poem, is to abate the pride of the calculating understanding, and to reinstate the imagination and the affections in those seats from which modern philosophy has labored but too successfully to expel them. Life's autumn past, says the gray-haired wanderer. In the same spirit, those illusions of the imaginative faculty, to which the peasantry in solitary districts are peculiarly subject, are represented as the kindly ministers of conscience. Reverting to more distant ages of the world, the operation of that same faculty in producing the several fictions of Chaldean, Persian, and Grecian idolatry is described with such seductive power that the solitary, in good earnest, seems alarmed at the tendency of his own argument. Notwithstanding his fears, however, there is one thought so uncommonly fine, relative to the spirituality which lay hid beneath the gross material forms of Greek worship, in metal or stone, that we cannot resist the allurement of transcribing it. In discourse like this, the first day passes away. The second, for this almost dramatic poem takes up the action of 2 summer days, is varied by the introduction of the village priest, to whom the wanderer resigns the office of chief speaker, which had been yielded to his age and experience on the first. The conference is begun at the gate of the churchyard, and after some natural speculations concerning death and immortality, and the custom of funereal and sepulchral observances, as deduced from a feeling of immortality, certain doubts are proposed respecting the quantity of moral worth existing in the world, and in that mountainous district in particular. In the resolution of these doubts, the priest enters upon a most affecting and singular strain of narration, derived from the graves around him. Pointing to hillock after hillock, he gives short histories of their tenants, disclosing their humble virtues and touching with tender hand upon their frailties. Nothing can be conceived finer than the manner of introducing these tales. With heaven above his head, and the moldering turf at his feet, standing betwixt life and death, he seems to maintain that spiritual relation which he bore to his living flock in its undiminished strength, even with their ashes, and to be in his proper cure or diocese among the dead. We might extract powerful instances of pathos from these tales, the story of Ellen in particular, but their force is in combination, and in the circumstances under which they are introduced. The traditionary anecdote of the Jacobite and Hanoverian, as less liable to suffer by transplanting, and as affording an instance of that finer species of humor, that thoughtful playfulness in which the author more nearly perhaps than in any other quality resembles Cowper, we shall lay, at least a part of it, before our readers. It is the story of a Whig who, having wasted a large estate in election contests, retired, beneath a borrowed name, to a small town among these northern mountains, where a Caledonian laird, PG 197, a follower of the House of Stuart, who had fled his country after the overthrow at Culloden, returning with the return of lenient times, had also fixed his residence. The causes which have prevented the poetry of Mr. Wordsworth from attaining its full share of popularity are to be found in the boldness and originality of his genius. The times are past when a poet could securely follow the direction of his own mind into whatever tracks it might lead. A writer who would be popular must timidly coast the shore of prescribed sentiment and sympathy. He must have just as much more of the imaginative faculty than his readers, as will serve to keep their apprehensions from stagnating, but not so much as to alarm their jealousy. He must not think or feel too deeply. If he has had the fortune to be bred in the midst of the most magnificent objects of creation, he must not have given away his heart to them. Or if he have, he must conceal his love, or not carry his expressions of it beyond that point of rapture, which the occasional tourist thinks it not overstepping decorum to betray, or the limit which that gentlemanly spy upon nature, the picturesque traveler, has vouchsafed to countenance. He must do this, or be content to be thought an enthusiast. If from living among simple mountaineers, from a daily intercourse with them, not upon the footing of a patron, but in the character of an equal, he has detected, or imagines that he has detected, through the cloudy medium of their unlettered discourse, thoughts and apprehensions not vulgar, traits of patience and constancy, love unwearied, and heroic endurance not unfit, as he may judge, to be made the subject of verse, he will be deemed a man of perverted genius by the philanthropist who, conceiving of the peasantry of his country only as objects of a pecuniary sympathy, starts at finding them elevated to a level of humanity with himself. PG 199 having their own loves, enmities, cravings, aspirations, and c. as much beyond his faculty to believe as his beneficence to supply. If from a familiar observation of the ways of children, and much more from a retrospect of his own mind when a child, he has gathered more reverential notions of that state than fall to the lot of ordinary observers, and, escaping from the dissonant wranglings of men, has tuned his lyre, though but for occasional harmonies, to the milder utterance of that soft age. His verses shall be censured as infantile by critics who confound poetry, having children for its subject, with poetry that is childish, and who, having themselves perhaps never been children, never having possessed the tenderness and docility of that age, know not what the soul of a child is, how apprehensive, how imaginative, how religious. We have touched upon some of the causes which we conceive to have been unfriendly to the author's former poems. We think they do not apply in the same force to the one before us. There is in it more of uniform elevation, a wider scope of subject, less of manner, and it contains none of those starts and imperfect shapings which in some of this author's smaller pieces offended the weak and gave scandal to the perverse. It must indeed be approached with seriousness. It has in it much of that quality which draws the devout, deterring the profane. Those who hate the Paradise Lost will not love this poem. The steps of the great master are discernible in it, not in direct imitation or injurious parody, but in the following of the spirit, in free homage and generous subjection. One objection it is impossible not to foresee. It will be asked, why put such eloquent discourse in the mouth of a peddler? It might be answered that Mr. Wordsworth's plan required a character in humble life to be the organ of his philosophy. It was in harmony with the system and scenery of his poem. We read Piers Plowman's Creed, and the lowness of the teacher seems to add a simple dignity to the doctrine. Besides, the poet has bestowed an unusual share of education upon him. Is it too much to suppose that the author, at some early period of his life, may himself have known such a person, a man endowed with sentiments above his situation, another Burns, and that the dignified strains which he has attributed to the wanderer may be no more than PG 200 recollections of his conversation, heightened only by the amplification natural to poetry, or the luster which imagination flings back upon the objects and companions of our youth? After all, if there should be found readers willing to admire the poem, who yet feel scandalized at a name, we would advise them, wherever it occurs, to substitute silently the word Palmer, or Pilgrim, or any less offensive designation, which shall connect the notion of sobriety in heart and manners with the experience and privileges which a wayfaring life confers.